She parked a champagne-colored SUV directly on my tomato beds, her tires still hissing from the heat, heels clacking against my gravel like it was her red carpet, and before I could say a word, Karen flipped down her sunglasses, pointed at me with a plastic wine glass, and shouted across my own land, "You really should do something about the dust, neighbor. It's ruining our party photos." That was the exact moment I realized I wasn't dealing with a rude neighbor or a pushy homeowner. I was dealing with the self-declared queen of HOA-induced chaos, and her kingdom had apparently expanded onto my private mountain cabin property without my consent. What followed wasn't a misunderstanding or a polite boundary correction. It was war. It began with a wedding I didn't approve, evolved into golf carts tearing up my trails, and climaxed when I woke up to 30 strangers doing keg stands on my dock, one of them using my fishing rod to spear marshmallows. This wasn't the neighborhood I bought into. In fact, it wasn't a neighborhood at all. I lived 15 miles from the nearest gas station. And yet Karen, who had recently bought a McMansion down the slope with her husband Greg, had appointed herself president of the Winding Pines Valley HOA, which, conveniently, only included properties she liked and excluded any legal formality. Her logic? If we can see it, it's part of the community. Unfortunately for me, her guests could see my lake, my dock, my gardens, and eventually my patience wearing thin. The trouble had started small, almost laughably so. First, it was just a few SUVs using my turnaround spot like it was a valet loop. Then, a bounce house appeared near the edge of my pine grove, no invitation, no permission. At first I figured it was a fluke. A GPS mistake, maybe. But no. Karen strutted down my hill that afternoon in a neon pink tracksuit, clipboard in hand, informing me that her niece's birthday party had spilled over slightly, and that I should celebrate community rather than complain about grass stains. I was stunned. I'd lived here nearly 10 years without so much as a hiking couple crossing my fence line, and suddenly there were toddlers pelting each other with juice boxes under my trees. I tried to be civil, as one does. I explained that the property was privately owned, fully fenced, legally deeded. I even showed her the boundary markers and my survey papers. Karen tilted her head, adjusted her glittery headband, and said, "Well, that's just your opinion." I laughed. I shouldn't have. Because 2 days later, I found her husband Greg trimming my hedges with hedge clippers he proudly claimed he'd borrowed from my unlocked toolshed, which he'd entered for the greater good of the HOA's appearance. I should have put up a no trespassing sign then, but I still believed in decency. That belief died the day Karen hosted what she called the annual welcome picnic, a sort of fantasy community event that included a full DJ, rented porta-potties, folding chairs scattered across my dock, and, most infuriating, 2 rental vans unloading food warmers in my driveway. When I confronted her, dripping lake water from having chased a teenager off my canoe, Karen looked me dead in the eyes and said, "This is technically a shared ecosystem." I didn't even know what that meant. I started documenting everything: photos, videos, tire tracks, foot traffic, names, even receipts from the porta-potty company, which, oddly enough, listed my address. My lawyer friend Josh from town laughed so hard when I showed him that invoice, he nearly choked on his coffee. But then his face went serious. "They're building a paper trail. If she hosts enough events using your land, and no one stops her, she can eventually claim easement or community access. If a judge buys that, you're toast." I froze. Toast. Toast on land I paid cash for. Toast on soil I tilled, on the dock I built, the fences I strung by hand. And all because I didn't scream when the bounce house showed up? That's when I stopped being passive. That night, I closed my laptop and pulled out my old army crate. I hadn't used these skills since Afghanistan, but the principles of deterrence were universal. First came the cameras, then motion lights, then industrial signage, the kind that rattles when the wind kicks up. Private property. Video surveillance. Tire spikes ahead. But the signs were mocked. Greg posted selfies pretending to be impaled. Karen posted on the fake HOA Facebook group. "Don't worry folks, our neighbor is just playing frontier sheriff. Come anyway, we'll have extra sangria." When that post hit 60 likes, I hit the hardware store. I wasn't bluffing. I installed a removable tire trap, an honest-to-God steel spike strip, professionally mounted and legally within my rights, just inside the interior curve of my access road. And I left it disarmed the first 2 days, just to gauge reaction. Predictably, Greg drove over it 10 times in his golf cart, making obnoxious honking noises, daring fate. I waited. On day 3, Karen's cousin, an Instagram wellness influencer, arrived in a rented black Escalade, windows down, blasting techno at 9 in the morning. She didn't stop. She didn't see the newly armed spikes. And when the front tires went out with a twin hiss like a python striking, followed by the sickening slump of rubber and steel grinding together, I stepped out onto my porch with my coffee, nodded once, and waved. Karen screamed loud enough to echo through the valley. The influencer cried. Greg demanded to see my credentials. But the sheriff who arrived 2 hours later? He just leaned against his cruiser, chewed on a toothpick and said, "Well, it is his land. Y'all might want to consider RSVPing next time." That incident wasn't the end, not even close. But it was the turning point. Because from that moment on, I stopped being a passive target for HOA fantasy games. I became the immovable object. And Karen? She was about to find out what happens when you keep poking a man who builds gates for fun and sets traps with precision. The morning after the tire trap incident, I was sipping coffee on the porch, expecting some kind of retaliation, but what I didn't expect was a photographer in cargo shorts sneaking around my pine grove like he was on safari. He had a giant lens, one of those obnoxious telescopic things, and was taking photos of the flattened Escalade tires like he was documenting rare wildlife. I called out casually, asking if he needed help or directions, but he just muttered something about evidence for the HOA newsletter. I almost spit out my coffee laughing. The newsletter. It had apparently become a real thing now, printed on glossy paper and delivered by Karen's troop of teenage volunteers, most of whom were bribed with soda and free Wi-Fi. That's when it hit me. They weren't just trespassing for parties anymore. This was turning into a full-blown PR campaign. Karen was trying to rewrite reality, frame me as the villain of some suburban saga, and she was doing it with pictures, stories, and just enough fake legality to fool the less observant. The next edition of the newsletter included a full-page editorial titled "Hostility in the Hillside: One Man's War Against Community Spirit," and featured an artistic rendering of me holding a pitchfork. They really had someone draw it. I'd never owned a pitchfork in my life, but the illustration was flattering in its own way, made me look about 30 pounds lighter, with heroic cheekbones. The absurdity was entertaining until I realized the number of guests had doubled. That weekend, I counted close to 80 cars parked in every available sliver of space along the dirt road that curled near my fence. They weren't on my property yet, but it was getting harder to tell where the public trail ended and my boundary began. A couple even had the audacity to walk their poodles across my yard, waving politely like this was some kind of open dog park. That same afternoon, I found a pair of strangers fishing off my dock. They offered me a beer like I was a park ranger doing a courtesy check. I told them to leave, firmly but calmly, and they did, but not before asking if there were restrooms nearby. Apparently, Karen had told guests there were public facilities available at the bottom of the hill, my composting outhouse. I don't even use it anymore. But that explained the foot traffic I kept spotting near my woodshed. Something had to give, and fast. I started reviewing local zoning laws, county land use codes, even old land dispute case law. I wanted to be airtight, bulletproof, legally unshakable. If Karen wanted a war of bureaucracy, she'd get it. I filed a formal cease and desist letter with my lawyer's help and had it hand-delivered to Karen's home by a county-certified process server. I even had the guy wear a GoPro for proof of delivery. Karen, of course, posted the video to her group with a caption, "More intimidation tactics from the mountain menace." But the letter had the desired effect. It made her slow down. For exactly 3 days. On the 4th day, a convoy of golf carts appeared, decorated with banners reading, HOA Unity Ride. It was a parade. An actual parade. On dirt roads in golf carts. One cart had a papier-mâché model of my cabin roof. Another had a giant speaker blaring, "We are family." I could only watch in silence as they circled the base of my hill, honking and waving like they'd conquered Rome. But I noticed something even more concerning. Greg and another man were walking the perimeter with a measuring wheel. Land surveyors. Or pretending to be. They had clipboards and reflective vests, and every time I looked at them, they looked away quickly. When I finally walked down to confront them, Greg claimed they were preparing a shared utility upgrade plan. I told him utilities didn't cross my land, and he shrugged, saying, "They will eventually." Progress, buddy. That night I updated my security system, adding infrared sensors and alert zones mapped to my phone. I wasn't going to let them sneak anything in under cover of darkness. And it's good I did, because 2 nights later, I caught footage of a flatbed truck backing toward my property line with what looked like a prefab shed on its bed. They were planning to build something. Possibly a viewing deck, or maybe a snack shack for their weekend event. I activated the floodlights and the truck reversed and bolted, but not before I caught the license plate. I turned that footage over to the sheriff, who agreed this had gone far enough. The next morning, a deputy showed up at Karen's house with a warning: no new structures without permits, especially not on someone else's land. Karen went ballistic. She stomped up my driveway, red in the face, demanding to know why I was harassing her community. I calmly handed her a copy of the footage, and asked if she wanted me to send it to the local news. She hissed like a teakettle and stormed off. But her eyes said she wasn't done. A week passed. A quiet one. Too quiet. No parties, no parades, no newsletters. I started to relax. Maybe the message had finally sunk in. Maybe I could enjoy the fall breeze without dodging frisbees or strangers asking if I had any extra propane for the grill. I should have known better. That Friday, I woke to a new sound, metal on metal, scraping and clanking. I threw on boots and rushed outside to find Greg and 2 other men trying to lift my tire trap out of the road with a winch. They were sweating, cursing, wearing gloves. I shouted, and they dropped everything and ran like teenagers caught stealing beer. I called the sheriff again. This time it wasn't just a warning. The deputy filed a formal trespassing report and opened a criminal mischief case. Karen tried to claim it was community maintenance, but the footage spoke louder than her excuses. She was cited. Officially. I thought that might finally end things. But Karen was nothing if not stubborn. That weekend, she escalated. A new sign appeared at the base of my driveway, staked into the dirt by her husband. It read, HOA Event Parking Overflow, Use Courtesy Trail Behind Fence. She had given my property an access trail. She was now assigning directions on where to park. It was like watching someone lose their grip on reality in real time. I yanked the sign out of the ground and threw it in a trash barrel, but the feeling of being hunted had returned. They weren't going to stop until they found a way to take something I wouldn't give. So I drew up the real plan. The one I hadn't used since college, when I worked for my uncle's security firm. I wasn't going to just defend my property anymore. I was going to create an event so undeniably disruptive, so perfectly lawful and stunningly inconvenient, that the HOA would never set foot on my land again. I just needed one more incident to justify it. And judging by Karen's pattern, I wouldn't have to wait long. By the time Monday morning rolled around, I had already printed and filed every relevant complaint, time-stamped the footage, and sent copies